On the evening of November 4, 1942, Generalleutnant Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma sat in the back of a British staff car traveling north from El Alamein toward Cairo, watching the desert fade into darkness while his hands remained bound with standard-issue rope that cut into his wrists every time the vehicle hit a rut in the sand. 52 years old. 48 hours a prisoner. Commander of the Africa Corps for exactly 17 days before a British tank shell destroyed his command vehicle and left him standing alone in the smoke with his hands raised. He had spent the previous night in a tent surrounded by British guards who spoke in low voices about Montgomery's advance and Rommel's retreat. Now they were taking him somewhere else. No one had explained where. The car smelled of diesel and cigarette smoke. 2 guards sat in front. Neither spoke German. Neither looked back. Von Thoma watched headlights from the convoy behind them bounce across empty desert. He counted 12 vehicles. All heading north. All carrying German prisoners. The war was over for him, but the implications of that fact had not yet settled into understanding. In his tunic pocket was a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters taken in Berlin 3 years earlier, 1939, before Poland, before France, before this desert that had swallowed everything he believed about warfare. The photograph showed 3 smiling faces in a garden. The girls wore white dresses. His wife wore pearls. The image belonged to another world. A world where Germany was ascending. Where the Führer promised a 1,000-year Reich built on discipline, racial purity, and absolute certainty about which cultures deserved to exist and which deserved extinction. Von Thoma had believed. Believed in racial hierarchy. Believed in cultural superiority. Believed in the necessity of crushing degenerate art and degenerate music. Believed that jazz was Niederhausen, Negro music, that corrupted the Aryan spirit. Believed that swing rhythms and improvisation represented chaos, represented Africa, represented everything the Reich was purifying from European civilization. He had attended Hitler Youth rallies in Munich where the bands played only approved German marches. Had watched book burnings in Frankfurt where they threw jazz recordings onto the flames alongside literature by Jews and communists. Had read Goebbels' speeches explaining how American jazz was a Jewish plot to weaken German youth. Had enforced regulations in his own command forbidding soldiers from listening to swing music on captured radios. The regulations were clear. Jazz was forbidden. Saxophones, syncopation, improvisation, all symptoms of racial degeneracy. In 1938, he had attended an exhibition in Düsseldorf called Entartete Musik, Degenerate Music. The exhibition featured enlarged photographs of black American musicians playing instruments with exaggerated expressions. Captions explained how Jewish producers promoted this primitive noise to destroy German culture. One display showed a saxophone wrapped in barbed wire with a placard reading, "Instrument of Racial Pollution." Von Thoma had stood in front of that display for several minutes, nodding in agreement. That was 4 years ago. Before the desert. Before defeat. Before the rope around his wrists and the silence of 2 British guards who wouldn't tell him where they were taking him. The convoy stopped at a checkpoint. Voices in English. Documents examined. Then movement again. The desert gave way to scattered buildings. Electric lights appeared. They were entering Cairo. Von Thoma recognized minarets against the sky. Muslim architecture. Foreign territory. But British-controlled. Everywhere he looked, British military vehicles. British uniforms. British flags. The victors. The staff car turned onto a wide boulevard lined with palm trees. The buildings here were substantial. Colonial administration. Military headquarters. The car slowed, turned again, stopped in front of a 3-story structure with arched windows and guards at the entrance. One of the British soldiers opened the back door, gestured for Von Thoma to exit. Inside, the building was cool. Ceiling fans turned slowly. British officers moved through corridors carrying papers and maps. No one paid attention to him. Just another German general processed through the system. He was led upstairs to the 2nd floor, down a hallway, into a large room with a high ceiling and windows overlooking the street. The room was a mess hall. 50 men sat at long tables eating dinner. All German. All officers. Von Thoma recognized several faces. Colonel Briel from the 21st Panzer Division. Major Hartmann from Signals Intelligence. Others he knew only by reputation. All captured. All eating British rations on tin plates. All wearing the same expression of quiet humiliation. A British captain approached. Spoke in careful German. Said von Thoma would be held here temporarily before transfer to a permanent POW facility. Said there were rules. No attempts to escape. No discussions of military intelligence. No fraternization with British personnel. Said dinner was served at 6. Breakfast at 7. Said the Red Cross would inspect conditions regularly. Said letters home were permitted once per month, subject to censorship. The captain pointed to an empty chair at the end of one table. Said that was von Thoma's assigned seat. Then walked away. Von Thoma stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at 50 German officers eating in silence while Egyptian servants cleared plates and British guards watched from the corners. This was imprisonment. Not a cell. Not chains. But imprisonment nonetheless. The end of command. The end of purpose. The beginning of waiting for a war to end while having no role in its conclusion. He walked to the empty chair, sat down, accepted a plate of food from a servant who avoided eye contact. The food was adequate. Chicken, rice, vegetables. British standards. He ate mechanically. Tasted nothing. Around him, officers spoke in low voices about battles lost, units destroyed, comrades killed. The conversation was factual, restrained. No one mentioned the larger questions. No one asked why they lost. No one questioned the ideology that had brought them here. After dinner, the officers were led to a common room on the 3rd floor. The room had sofas, chairs, tables, a bookshelf with German novels. Windows overlooked the Cairo street. Guards stood at both doors. This was where prisoners spent their evenings. Reading. Writing letters. Playing chess. Waiting. Von Thoma found an empty chair near a window, sat down, looked out at the city. Below, Egyptian civilians walked past British soldiers. A tram rattled down the street. Automobile horns. The sounds of a city that continued its life regardless of who was winning or losing the war in the desert beyond. He thought about his wife's last letter. She had written about food shortages in Berlin. About bombing raids. About their daughters helping with civil defense preparations. She had not mentioned doubt. Had not questioned victory. Had signed the letter, Heil Hitler. That was the world he came from. The world he would return to. Eventually. When the war ended. If Germany won, he would be repatriated to a hero's welcome. If Germany lost, he did not complete the thought. One of the British guards said something to his colleague. Both laughed. The sound was strange in this room full of German silence. Von Thoma realized he had not heard laughter in weeks. Not since before El Alamein. Not since before the British artillery had begun its systematic destruction of every position the Afrika Korps tried to hold. A British lieutenant entered the common room carrying a wooden box. He set it on a table near the center. Several German officers looked up with vague curiosity. The lieutenant opened the box, removed a machine, set it on the table. A gramophone. Spring wound. Portable. Standard British military issue. Von Thoma had seen similar machines in captured supply depots. The lieutenant wound the crank, selected a record from the box, placed it on the turntable. Said something in English that von Thoma didn't understand. Then the lieutenant left the room. The gramophone began to play. And that was when Generalleutnant Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma heard jazz for the first time in his life. The first sound was a trumpet. Single note. Held. Then bent. Down, then up, then down again. Not a march. Not a melody he recognized. The note wavered with human breath, with intention, with something that sounded like questioning. Then drums. Brushes on snare. Soft. Syncopated. Off the beat. Then bass. Walking. For notes per measure but not where he expected them. His mind tried to organize the rhythm into something familiar. German marches had precise meter. 1 2 3 4. Strong beats on 1 and 3. But this music put accents on 2 and 4. Backward. Wrong. Or not wrong. Different. Piano entered. Right hand playing melody fragments. Left hand playing chords that didn't resolve the way classical harmony resolved. The melody wandered. Started in one key, moved to another, returned halfway. Like a conversation with multiple speakers. Like a question that generated more questions. Von Thoma sat very still. His training told him this was degenerate music. Negro music. The kind of music Goebbels had condemned. The kind of music the Reich banned from German radio. The kind of music that appeared in Entartete Musik exhibitions with captions warning about racial pollution. He should stand up. Walk away. Refuse to listen. That would be the ideologically correct response. He did not stand up. He remained in his chair by the window, listening. Because something unexpected was happening. The music was complex. More complex than he had been told. The trumpet was not playing primitive rhythms. It was playing a melody that required technical skill. The intervals were sophisticated. The phrasing was deliberate. The musician knew music theory. Knew harmony. Knew how to construct a solo that built tension and released it. This was not chaos. This was structure. Different structure. Structure he didn't recognize immediately. But structure nonetheless. The trumpet solo ended. Saxophone began. Different voice. Different approach to the same harmonic progression. The saxophone player bent notes the way the trumpet player had, but went in different directions. Found different paths through the chord changes. Made different choices about when to land on consonant intervals and when to use dissonance. Von Thoma found himself leaning forward slightly. Listening more closely. Trying to understand the logic. In German military music, every instrument had an assigned role. First violin played melody. Second violin played harmony. Tuba played bass notes. Timpani played rhythmic punctuation. Each musician followed the score exactly as written. No deviation. No improvisation. Unity through conformity. But in this music, each musician was speaking. Having a conversation with the other musicians. Responding to what the previous soloist played. Building on ideas. Disagreeing. Proposing alternatives. The pianist played something angular and dissonant. The bassist responded with something melodic and smooth. The drummer answered both with rhythmic complexity that somehow held everything together. It sounded like democracy. That was the thought that occurred to him. It sounded like democracy in sound form. Multiple voices. Individual expression within collective structure. Agreement and disagreement happening simultaneously. And the result was not chaos. The result was coherence of a different kind. Coherence built from the bottom up rather than imposed from the top down. Von Thoma realized his foot was tapping. Unconsciously. Following the rhythm. The offbeat rhythm that his conscious mind still categorized as wrong. But his body was responding to it naturally. As if human beings were designed to respond to these rhythms. As if the syncopation was not degenerate but fundamental. The record ended. The gramophone needle lifted automatically, returned to its rest position. Silence in the common room. Von Thoma looked around. Other German officers were staring at the gramophone. Some with confusion. Some with something else. Interest. Curiosity. One officer, Major Hartmann, was smiling slightly. Caught himself. Stopped smiling. Looked away. The British lieutenant returned, changed the record, wound the gramophone, left again. Another jazz performance began. This one faster. More aggressive. The trumpet sounded angry. The drums responded with aggression. But it was controlled aggression. Channeled aggression. The musicians were fighting with sound, not with violence. Arguing with notes. The energy was intense but not destructive. Von Thoma thought about the battlefield. Thought about orders he had given. Thought about soldiers following those orders without question because questioning orders meant death. Thought about the hierarchy he had operated within his entire adult life. The Führer commanded. Generals obeyed. Colonels obeyed generals. Soldiers obeyed colonels. All the way down. A vertical chain of absolute authority. And he had never questioned that structure. Had believed it was the only possible structure. The only way to organize human beings effectively. But this music suggested something else. Suggested that creativity could emerge from horizontal relationships. Suggested that individuals responding to each other, listening to each other, building on each other's ideas, could produce something more complex and more beautiful than any single authority could impose from above. And that thought was dangerous. That thought contradicted everything he had built his life around. So he pushed it away. Told himself he was simply tired. Told himself the defeat at El Alamein had clouded his judgment. Told himself this was just music. Sound waves. Nothing more. Certainly not evidence that the ideological foundations of the Reich were questionable. But the thought would not stay pushed away. Because the evidence was there in the air, in the room, in his own involuntary physical response to rhythms his ideology said should repel him. His foot kept tapping. His body kept responding. And his mind kept analyzing the musical structure, finding sophisticated compositional techniques, recognizing that the musicians playing this music were not primitive. Were not degenerate. Were not racially inferior. Were in fact doing something he could not do. Something none of the German officers in this room could do. Creating beauty through improvised collaboration in real time. Without a conductor. Without written orders. Without hierarchy. The second record ended. The British lieutenant returned. This time he spoke to one of the guards in English. The guard nodded, left the room briefly, returned with a stack of additional records. Set them on the table next to the gramophone. The lieutenant gestured toward the records, said something in English that von Thoma still didn't understand, then left. The records sat there. Available. None of the German officers moved toward them. They looked at each other. Uncertain. To play the records would be to voluntarily listen to jazz. To participate in their own cultural corruption. That was what they had been taught. That was what they believed. But they were also bored. And imprisoned. And the alternative was sitting in silence remembering battles lost. So after several minutes, Major Hartmann stood up, walked to the gramophone, selected a record, wound the crank, placed the needle. Sat back down. Waited. Duke Ellington. Mood Indigo. Von Thoma didn't know the name. Didn't know the composer. But he heard something in the opening bars that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Melancholy. The trumpets played in close harmony. Minor key. Slow tempo. The melody descended in half steps. Each note held just long enough to establish emotional weight. Then released. Then the next note. Lower. Heavier. This was not primitive. This was not chaotic. This was sophisticated emotional expression through organized sound. The same thing Brahms did. The same thing Wagner did. But with different tools. Different harmonic language. Different rhythmic approach. But the underlying intent was identical. To communicate feeling that words could not capture. Von Thoma closed his eyes. Let the music play without visual distraction. Heard the saxophone section blend into a single voice. Heard the piano fill spaces between melody phrases with delicate chord voicings. Heard the bass walk through the harmonic progression with note choices that implied melancholy without stating it directly. Subtlety. Nuance. Restraint. When the record ended, he opened his eyes. Several other officers were also sitting with eyes closed. Listening. Not analyzing. Not judging. Just listening. Experiencing. The way human beings experienced music before ideology told them which music was acceptable and which was forbidden. Over the next 3 hours, 12 records played. Different styles. Different tempos. Different artists. All jazz. All technically accomplished. All emotionally resonant. And with each record, von Thoma felt something shifting in his understanding. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But gradually. Like a door opening slowly in a dark room, letting in light 1 degree at a time. By 10 o'clock, half the German officers in the common room were listening openly. Some tapped fingers on armrests. Some nodded heads slightly. Some simply stared at the gramophone with expressions of concentration. They were not supposed to enjoy this music. But some of them clearly did. And that created cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Von Thoma thought about the exhibition in Düsseldorf. The photographs of black musicians with exaggerated features. The saxophone wrapped in barbed wire. The message that this music represented racial corruption. But he had now heard the music itself. Not descriptions of the music. Not propaganda about the music. The actual music. And the actual music contradicted the propaganda completely. Which meant either the propaganda was wrong, or his ears were deceiving him. And his ears seemed reliable. They had served him well for 52 years. They heard complexity where he had been told there was only simplicity. They heard beauty where he had been told there was only degeneracy. They heard disciplined creativity where he had been told there was only chaos. One conclusion followed from that observation. The propaganda was wrong. The ideology that classified human beings by race and cultures by hierarchy was wrong. And if that was wrong, then what else was wrong? What else had he believed without examining the evidence? What else had he accepted because authorities he trusted told him it was true? These questions did not come with answers. Not yet. They simply existed in his mind as new possibilities. Uncomfortable possibilities. Dangerous possibilities. The kind of possibilities that, if pursued to their logical conclusions, would require him to reconsider his entire worldview. His entire life. Every decision he had made based on the assumption that the Reich was correct about racial hierarchy, cultural purity, and the necessity of eliminating inferior elements from civilization. At 11 o'clock, the British guards announced that prisoners should return to their sleeping quarters. The officers stood, formed a line, followed the guards downstairs to converted offices where cots had been arranged in rows. Von Thoma found his assigned cot, lay down in his uniform, stared at the ceiling. He could hear Cairo through the open windows. Automobile engines. Distant music. Voices in Arabic. The city continued its life. The world continued its motion. And somewhere in America, black musicians were creating sophisticated art that Nazi ideology said was impossible. Creating it despite oppression. Despite Jim Crow laws. Despite being told by white Americans that they were inferior. Creating it anyway. Because creativity was not a function of race. Beauty was not limited to Aryans. Human capability was distributed across all populations equally. Von Thoma realized he was crying. Quietly. Without sound. Tears running down his face in the darkness. Crying for reasons he could not yet articulate. Grief perhaps. Grief for all the years he had lived inside a lie. Grief for all the decisions he had made based on that lie. Grief for the possibility that he had participated in evil while believing he was participating in something noble. The tears stopped eventually. He lay awake until dawn. Thinking about music. Thinking about ideology. Thinking about truth. On November 5, 1942, von Thoma woke at 0600 hours as he had every morning for 30 years of military service. But this morning felt different. The room was the same. The cot was the same. The British guards at the door were the same. But something in his perception had shifted during the night. The world looked identical but meant something different. At breakfast, he sat at his assigned place. Ate porridge and bread. Drank bitter British tea. Watched other officers eat in silence. Wondered if any of them had experienced what he experienced the previous evening. Wondered if any of them were having the same thoughts. Wondered if any of them were considering the possibility that their entire ideological framework was constructed on false premises. He could not ask. To ask would be to reveal doubt. And doubt was weakness. Weakness was unacceptable. A German general did not express uncertainty about the Reich's righteousness. Especially not as a prisoner. Especially not where conversations might be overheard by British intelligence officers who would write reports that might eventually reach Berlin. So he ate in silence like everyone else. Kept his thoughts private. Maintained the appearance of ideological certainty. After breakfast, prisoners were permitted to walk in a courtyard behind the building. 2 hours of exercise. Armed guards at all corners. High walls. No possibility of escape. Von Thoma walked slowly around the perimeter. Other officers walked in pairs or small groups. Speaking quietly. Discussing what? Strategy. Families. The likelihood of German victory. He didn't join them. Preferred solitude. Needed time to think. The courtyard had a fountain. Not functioning. Just a dry basin with decorative tiles. Von Thoma sat on the edge, looked up at the sky. Clear. Blue. The same sky over Cairo as over Berlin. The same sun. The same physical laws of light and atmosphere. Borders were human inventions. National identity was human invention. Race was human invention. But the sky was real. Music was real. Human creativity was real. He thought about his daughters. 13 and 15. Growing up in Nazi Germany. Learning racial ideology in school. Learning that some humans were superior and others inferior. Learning that German culture was the apex of civilization. Learning that jazz was degenerate. Learning lies. And believing those lies because children believed what adults taught them. Just as he had believed what his parents and teachers taught him in the 1890s and 1900s. Just as every generation believed what the previous generation passed down. But beliefs could be wrong. Could be maintained for decades or centuries without ever being examined. Could persist because examining them was uncomfortable. Because changing them would require admitting error. Because admitting error would require accepting responsibility for actions taken based on false beliefs. And accepting that responsibility was painful. So people didn't examine. Didn't change. Didn't accept. Just continued believing. Continued acting. Continued passing the beliefs to the next generation. Von Thoma wondered what would happen if he returned to Berlin and told his daughters that racial ideology was false. That jazz was not degenerate. That human beings were equal regardless of skin color. They would report him to authorities. Children in Nazi Germany were encouraged to report ideological deviation even in their own families. Even their own parents. Loyalty to the Reich came before family loyalty. That was doctrine. That was policy. So if he spoke truth, he would be arrested. Interrogated. Probably executed. His wife and daughters would be punished as family members of a traitor. They would lose social standing, employment, housing. They would become pariahs. All because he acknowledged what his ears had heard. What his mind had understood. What his conscience now recognized as true. Therefore he could not speak truth. Not safely. Not without destroying his family. So what was the alternative? Return to Germany. Resume his life. Pretend he still believed. Maintain the performance of ideological loyalty. Live inside cognitive dissonance until he died. Never speak honestly to anyone including himself. That prospect felt suffocating. Like being buried alive. Consciousness trapped inside a lie. Unable to express itself. Unable to align words with thoughts. Unable to act with integrity. Just, performing. Until death. He stood up from the fountain, resumed walking. Completed 3 more circuits of the courtyard. Then guards announced exercise period was over. Everyone back inside. The days developed a rhythm. Breakfast. Exercise. Lunch. Free time. Dinner. Common room. Sleep. Repeat. British efficiency applied to prisoner management. Keep them healthy. Keep them occupied. Prevent escape attempts. Wait for the war to end or for orders to transfer them to permanent facilities. Every evening, the gramophone appeared in the common room. The British lieutenant brought it at 8 o'clock. Set it on the table. Left the stack of records. Left the room. The same pattern. And every evening, German officers who had been taught to despise jazz gathered around that table. Selected records. Listened. Von Thoma watched the transformation happen slowly among his fellow prisoners. The first evening, they listened with suspicion. The second evening, with curiosity. The third evening, with interest. By the end of the first week, several officers were discussing the music. Comparing different artists. Debating which performances were more technically accomplished. Using musical terminology. Analyzing harmonic choices. Appreciating improvisational skill. They did not discuss the ideological implications. Did not acknowledge that appreciating Black American music contradicted everything the Reich taught about racial hierarchy. Did not mention that they were experiencing proof that Nazi cultural theory was false. They simply enjoyed the music. Responded to it. Let it affect them. And by doing so, they demonstrated, whether they realized it or not, that ideology could not survive contact with reality. By the second week, von Thoma noticed something else. The common room atmosphere had changed. Officers who had barely spoken to each other were now having conversations about music. Sharing opinions. Disagreeing respectfully. Laughing occasionally when a particular trumpet phrase surprised them or delighted them. The music was creating social bonds. Breaking down the isolation that military hierarchy enforced. Making these men more human to each other. One evening, Major Hartmann sat down next to von Thoma. Said quietly, "This music is not what we were told it was." Von Thoma looked at him. Waited. Hartmann continued. "I attended the Entartete Musik exhibition in '38. Believed what they said. But this." He gestured toward the gramophone. "This is not primitive. This is sophisticated." Von Thoma nodded slowly. Said nothing. Waited to see if Hartmann would continue. After a moment, Hartmann said, "Which means they lied to us. About this, at least. And if they lied about this, what else did they lie about?" Dangerous question. Von Thoma looked around. No British guards within earshot. Still, he kept his voice low. "I have been asking myself the same question." Hartmann leaned back. Closed his eyes. Listened to the saxophone solo flowing from the gramophone. Then said, "I have 3 sons. All in the Hitler Youth. Learning what we learned. Believing what we believed. When the war ends, if I go home, what do I tell them?" Von Thoma had no answer. The question was the same one he faced regarding his daughters. How do you tell your children that everything they've been taught is wrong? How do you explain that you participated in spreading those lies? How do you ask them to forgive you for not recognizing truth sooner? "I don't know," von Thoma said finally. "But I think we have to tell them something. Even if it costs us." Hartmann opened his eyes. Looked at von Thoma. "Costs us what?" "Everything." They sat in silence after that. Listening to Duke Ellington play, Solitude. The melody was simple. Just a few notes. But the emotional expression was profound. Loneliness conveyed through space between notes. Through silence that spoke. Through restraint that said more than complexity could say. By the third week, von Thoma had heard perhaps 100 jazz recordings. Big bands. Small combos. Vocalists. Instrumentalists. Different styles within the genre. Swing. Blues. Early bebop experiments. Each recording was evidence. Evidence that contradicted ideology. Evidence that demanded a response. Either reject the evidence or reject the ideology. There was no third option. No way to hold both truth and lie simultaneously. Von Thoma chose truth. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. Just quietly. Privately. In his own mind. He accepted that racial ideology was false. Accepted that he had believed lies. Accepted that he had participated in evil. Accepted that his life up to this point had been based on false premises. And accepting those things was like watching a building collapse. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about Germany, about civilization, about morality, all of it crumbling. Leaving him standing in rubble trying to figure out what could be rebuilt and what needed to be abandoned entirely. On November 24, 20 days after his capture, British authorities informed prisoners that they would be transferred to a permanent POW camp in England. The transfer would happen in stages. Von Thoma was in the first group. They would leave Cairo in 3 days. Fly to Gibraltar. Then by ship to Liverpool. Then by train to a camp in Bedfordshire. The journey would take 2 weeks. On his last evening in Cairo, von Thoma sat in the common room listening to the gramophone one final time. The record playing was Louis Armstrong. What a wonderful world. Von Thoma didn't know the title. Didn't understand all the English lyrics. But he understood the tone. Optimism. Gratitude. Recognition of beauty despite suffering. Despite racism. Despite oppression. Armstrong's voice carried warmth and wisdom. The voice of a man who had every reason to be bitter but chose joy instead. Von Thoma thought about that choice. Thought about whether he could make a similar choice. Could he choose to rebuild his understanding of the world around truth rather than lie? Could he choose integrity even if it cost him everything? Could he choose to be honest with his family even if they rejected him? Could he choose to acknowledge guilt even if no one forgave him? He didn't know. But he knew he had to try. The record ended. The gramophone went silent. Von Thoma stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Cairo one last time. Below, life continued. Egyptian vendors selling food. British soldiers on patrol. Civilians going about their business. The world was larger than Germany. Larger than the war. Larger than ideology. And somewhere in that larger world, people were creating beauty despite being told they were incapable of beauty. Creating meaning despite being told they were meaningless. Creating civilization despite being called uncivilized. And if they could do that, perhaps he could rebuild his life on truth. Perhaps anyone could. Perhaps that was what human dignity actually meant, the capacity to recognize error, accept responsibility, and choose differently going forward. Not because it was easy. But because it was necessary. The transfer to England took 16 days. Von Thoma spent most of that time in transit. Cargo aircraft to Gibraltar. Crowded ship across the Atlantic. Train through English countryside. Each day identical. Guards. Regulations. Rations. Boredom. But throughout the journey, he carried something new. A question that wouldn't leave him alone. What would he do with the understanding he had gained? The permanent POW camp was outside a village called Trent Park in Bedfordshire. 30 acres surrounded by barbed wire. Wooden barracks. Guard towers. Exercise yard. Mess hall. Medical station. The facility held approximately 200 German officers. All high-ranking. All separated from lower ranks because British intelligence wanted to monitor conversations among senior command. What they didn't tell prisoners was that every room was equipped with hidden microphones. Every conversation was recorded. Every word documented. Von Thoma learned this months later when the transcripts were partially declassified. But in December 1942, he knew nothing about surveillance. He simply tried to adjust to camp routine. Morning roll call. Breakfast. Exercise. Lunch. Free time. Dinner. Lights out. Day after day. Month after month. Year after year. Waiting for war to end. But this camp had something Cairo didn't have. A library. Small. Mostly donated books. German literature. Some English books with German translations. Philosophy. History. Poetry. And in one corner, on a bottom shelf, hidden behind other books, von Thoma found a collection of essays about American culture written by German émigrés who fled the Reich in the 1930s. Jews. Communists. Intellectuals who refused to stay silent when ideology became policy. One essay was about jazz. Written by someone named Theodor Adorno. The essay argued that jazz represented both the best and worst of American culture. Commodification and creativity. Oppression and resistance. Mass production and individual expression. Adorno was critical. But he was also honest. He acknowledged that black American musicians had created something genuinely new. Something that couldn't be dismissed as primitive or derivative. Something that deserved serious analysis. Von Thoma read the essay 3 times. Then read it again. Adorno's analysis was complex, full of technical musical terminology. But the fundamental argument was clear. Jazz was important. Not because it was perfect, but because it revealed something about human creativity under constraint. About how oppressed people created beauty as resistance. About how innovation happened at the margins of society, not at the center. That resonated. Von Thoma thought about his own position. Imprisoned. Powerless. Cut off from command. From authority. From the structure that had defined his identity. What could he create from this position? What could he build from the ruins of his previous understanding? What resistance could he offer against the ideology he had once served? The answer came slowly. Through reading. Through conversation with other prisoners who were also questioning. Through long nights lying awake thinking about responsibility and guilt and whether redemption was even possible for someone who had participated in evil. The answer was, testimony. He could bear witness. Could document what he had learned. Could leave a record that might help others avoid the mistakes he made. So he began writing. In secret. On scraps of paper. During moments when guards weren't watching. Short essays. Memories. Reflections. He wrote about the Entartete Musik exhibition. Wrote about the propaganda he believed. Wrote about hearing jazz for the first time in Cairo. Wrote about the cognitive dissonance. Wrote about choosing truth over ideology. Wrote about guilt. Wrote about the question of whether acknowledging guilt was sufficient or whether something more was required. He didn't have answers. Just questions. But he wrote the questions down. Because questions were important. Questions were how understanding began. Questions were how change started. Not with certainty. Not with dogma. Not with ideology. But with honest inquiry into what was true and what was false and how to tell the difference. Other prisoners noticed his writing. Some asked what he was working on. He said he was recording memories before he forgot them. Didn't mention the ideological content. Didn't mention the self-criticism. Didn't reveal that he was essentially writing a confession. A confession without a priest. Without absolution. Just acknowledgement. Just truth. Just one man's attempt to hold himself accountable when no one else could or would. By 1944, von Thoma had filled several notebooks. Hundreds of pages. All hidden in his mattress. All written in careful script. All documenting his ideological journey from certainty to doubt to understanding. He knew the writings were dangerous. If discovered by guards, they might be confiscated. If discovered by other prisoners still loyal to the Reich, he might be killed. If they somehow reached Berlin, his family would be arrested. So he wrote carefully. Used initials instead of names. Disguised locations. Made the content deniable if necessary. But he kept writing. Because not writing felt like capitulation. Like accepting that he would carry his understanding to the grave without sharing it. And that seemed wasteful. Seemed selfish. Seemed cowardly. If he had learned something important, he had obligation to pass it on. Even if no one ever read it. Even if it made no difference. The act of writing was itself meaningful. Was itself resistance. Was itself choosing truth over silence. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Von Thoma heard the news from a British guard who seemed almost disappointed that the war was over. No more enemy to fight. No more purpose to guard duty. Just administrative processing of prisoners waiting for repatriation. The process would take months. Maybe years. British authorities weren't in a hurry to send German officers home. Some were suspected of war crimes. Some were considered security risks. Some were just low priority. Von Thoma waited. Used the time to continue writing. By August 1945, he had completed what he considered his final essay. A letter to his daughters. Explaining what he had learned. Apologizing for raising them in ideology. Asking them to think critically. Asking them to question authority. Asking them to judge people by their character and actions, not by their race or nationality. Asking them to listen to jazz. Asking them to recognize that beauty came from unexpected places. asking them to live with integrity even when integrity was costly. He sealed the letter in an envelope. Addressed it. Kept it with him. Uncertain whether he would ever have courage to send it. Uncertain whether they would read it if he did. Uncertain whether it would make any difference. But he had written it. And writing it mattered. In December 1945, British authorities informed von Thoma he would be repatriated in January. Arrangements had been made. Transportation scheduled. He would return to Berlin. Would face whatever consequences awaited him there. Would reunite with his family if they still wanted to see him. Would try to rebuild a life from fragments. The night before departure, von Thoma removed the notebooks from his mattress. Read through them one final time. Considered burning them. Considered leaving them behind. Considered carrying them home. Each option had risks. But after consideration, he decided to carry them. Hide them in his luggage. Hope they weren't discovered during search. Hope that someday, somehow, they might be read by someone who needed to read them. On January 15, 1946, von Thoma boarded a train to London. Then a ship to Hamburg. Then another train to Berlin. The journey took 4 days. When he arrived, Berlin was ruins. Buildings destroyed. Streets full of rubble. People scavenging for food. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Had destroyed itself and half of Europe. Had killed millions. Had demonstrated conclusively that ideology divorced from reality always ended in catastrophe. His wife met him at the train station. She looked older. Thinner. Tired. They embraced. She cried. He cried. They didn't speak. Just held each other in the ruins of their city. Eventually she said his daughters were safe. Working in a factory. Making American cigarettes for occupation forces. They had survived. That was enough. That was everything. That evening, von Thoma gave his wife the letter. Said she should read it first. Decide whether the girls should read it. She read it that night while he slept. In the morning, she woke him. Said she had read it 3 times. Said she understood. Said she had been having similar doubts. Said she was glad he had written truth. Said the girls deserved to know. Said they would read it together as a family. They did. That afternoon. In their small apartment in what remained of their neighborhood. Von Thoma's wife, his 2 daughters, now 16 and 18. They read the letter. Then they discussed it. The daughters asked questions. Hard questions. About what he had done in the war. About what he believed. About why he waited so long to question. About whether he accepted responsibility. About what he would do now. He answered honestly. Said he had followed orders he shouldn't have followed. Said he believed lies he should have examined. Said he was guilty of moral cowardice. Said he accepted full responsibility. Said he didn't know what he would do now except try to live with integrity going forward. Said he couldn't undo the past but could choose differently in the future. Said he hoped they could forgive him eventually but understood if they couldn't. The older daughter asked one more question. She said, "What was the moment? The moment you realized you were wrong?" Von Thoma thought about how to answer. Could have mentioned the battlefield. The defeat. The imprisonment. But those weren't the moment. The moment was simpler. More specific. More personal. I heard music, he said. Music I had been taught to hate. And I realized it was beautiful. And that meant everything I believed about the people who made that music was false. And if that was false, everything else was questionable. The younger daughter asked, "What kind of music?" "Jazz." They looked at him. Confused. Jazz was still barely known in Germany. Still associated with Americans. With occupation. With the victors. Von Thoma said, "I want to play it for you. I want you to hear what I heard. But I don't have any recordings." The older daughter said, "The Americans have a radio station. AFN. They play American music. Including jazz. We listen sometimes. At work. The Germans pretend to hate it but secretly they like it. I like it too. It makes me feel something. I don't know what. Something hopeful. Von Thoma nodded. Said, that's exactly right. It makes you feel hope. Because it proves that human beings can create beauty even under oppression. Even when society says they're inferior. Even when they have every reason to give up. They create anyway. And that's important. That's proof of human dignity. They sat in silence after that. Then the younger daughter said, play it for us anyway. Describe it. Tell us what you heard. So he did. Spent the next hour describing jazz. The instruments. The rhythms. The improvisation. The way musicians conversed with sound. The way individuals expressed themselves within collective structure. The way the music embodied democracy. The way it challenged hierarchy. The way it insisted on human equality despite ideology saying otherwise. His daughters listened. His wife listened. And slowly, carefully, quietly, von Thoma began the process of teaching his family to think differently. To question authority. To judge by evidence rather than ideology. To recognize humanity in all people regardless of race or nationality. To understand that truth mattered more than loyalty. That integrity mattered more than comfort. That acknowledging error was strength, not weakness. It was a small beginning. One family. One conversation. One moment of honesty. But small beginnings were how change happened. Not through dramatic gestures. Not through revolutionary declarations. But through ordinary people choosing truth over lie. Choosing courage over fear. Choosing humanity over ideology. One decision at a time. One conversation at a time. One person at a time. Von Thoma lived another 30 years. Worked as a civilian. Never held military rank again. Never spoke publicly about the war. Never sought recognition. Never wrote memoirs. Just lived quietly. Raised his daughters. Watched them become adults who thought critically and questioned authority and treated people with dignity. Watched them raise children who did the same. Watched the slow generational change that happened when people chose differently. He kept the notebooks. Hidden. Private. Never showed them to anyone except his family. They stayed in a drawer in his apartment. Pages filled with handwriting documenting one man's journey from ideology to truth. Pages that proved transformation was possible. That acknowledgement was possible. That choosing integrity was possible even when costly. When he died in 1976, his daughters found the notebooks. Read them again. Discussed whether to publish them. Decided against it. The names were too identifiable. The content was too personal. The risk to others was too great. So they kept the notebooks. Passed them to the next generation. Let them exist as private family history. As evidence that their grandfather had tried to do better. Had tried to teach them better. Had tried to live with integrity after recognizing error. Those notebooks still exist. Somewhere. In someone's drawer. Unread by historians. Uncatalogued by archives. Just private family documents. But real. And true. And important. Because they prove that change is possible. That people can recognize they were wrong. Can choose differently. Can try to make amends. Can teach the next generation to avoid the mistakes they made. And the moment that started that change. A moment in Cairo in November 1942. An evening in a common room. A gramophone playing records. A Nazi general hearing jazz for the first time. Hearing beauty where ideology said beauty was impossible. Hearing proof that he had been lied to. Hearing evidence that demanded response. And choosing, slowly, carefully, painfully, to follow that evidence wherever it led. Even if it led to the collapse of everything he believed. Even if it meant acknowledging he had been wrong. Even if it meant accepting guilt without absolution. Because that was what integrity required. Not perfection. Not immediate transformation. Not redemption without cost. Just the willingness to recognize truth when encountered. The willingness to change when change was necessary. The willingness to teach others what you learned. The willingness to live the rest of your life trying to be better than you were before. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do. Recognize error. Acknowledge guilt. Choose differently going forward. Teach the next generation. Hope it makes a difference. No, it might not. Do it anyway. The music kept playing. In America. In Europe. Everywhere people listened. Jazz evolved. Changed. Grew. Influenced other genres. Became mainstream. Became history. But it still carried the same message it carried in 1942. The message that Generalleutnant Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma heard in a POW camp in Cairo. The message that changed his understanding of everything. The message was simple. Human beings are creative. Human beings are dignified. Human beings are equal. Ideology that denies these truths is false. And when you recognize falseness, you have two choices. Ignore it or acknowledge it. Ignore it and remain trapped in lie. Acknowledge it and begin the difficult work of living in truth. Von Thoma chose truth. Not because he was heroic. Not because he was especially brave. But because once he heard the evidence, he couldn't unhear it. Couldn't pretend it didn't exist. Couldn't continue believing lies when truth was available. So he changed. Slowly. Imperfectly. With many failures. But he changed. And that was what mattered. That was what lasted. That was what he passed to his children. Not ideology. Not dogma. Not certainty. But the capacity to recognize truth and the willingness to follow it wherever it led. 50 years after the war ended, one of von Thoma's granddaughters became a music teacher. She taught jazz. Taught improvisation. Taught her students about Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and the history of Black American music. Taught them that music was a form of resistance. That creativity was a form of dignity. That beauty could emerge from suffering. That human beings were equal regardless of what authority said. Her students asked where she learned this. She said her grandmother taught her. And her grandmother learned from her grandfather. And her grandfather learned in a POW camp in Egypt in 1942. Learned from a gramophone. Learned from records. Learned from listening to music he had been taught to hate. Learned that ideology could not survive contact with beauty. Learned that truth was stronger than lie. Learned that change was possible. The students listened. Some understood. Some didn't. But the story was told. The understanding was passed down. The legacy continued. Not dramatically. Not with monuments or recognition. Just quietly. One generation teaching the next. One person telling one story. One moment of honesty creating ripples that spread across decades. And somewhere in those ripples was the sound of a trumpet. Playing a melody. Bending notes. Asking questions. Not giving answers. Because music didn't give answers. Music asked better questions. And better questions led to better understanding. And better understanding led to better choices. And better choices led to better lives. One note at a time. One person at a time. One generation at a time. That was the legacy. Not of Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma. But of the music that changed him. The music that continued playing. Long after he died. Long after the war ended. Long after ideology collapsed. The music that insisted on human dignity when human dignity was denied. The music that created beauty when beauty was forbidden. The music that proved, over and over, in generation after generation, that human beings were equal, were creative, were worthy of respect, regardless of what authority claimed. The music that, in one November evening in 1942, taught a Nazi general that everything he believed was wrong. And gave him the courage to admit it.